Hi everyone, today we're going to delve into the concepts of the cell structure as well as taxonomy. Now when we talk about cell structure, we're going to talk about two different types of cells. We'll talk about eukaryotic cells, which are what the majority of our cells are made out of, or the group that we classify ourselves as. And then we'll also talk about prokaryotic cells, which make up our bacterial organisms, which again is the primary focus of this course. But it's important to understand the differences between both of those different types of cells. And then in addition, in this unit, we're also going to be talking about taxonomy, which is the classification of organisms. So to kind of roughly go over what we're going to talk about, we've got our eukaryotic cell structure, which again, these are the cells that make up our body. We'll talk about prokaryotic cell structure, which are cells that make up bacterial organisms. And then we'll talk about the differences in terms of the structural components that make up both groups of cells. And we'll also talk about the reproduction behavior of these cells, different organisms that make up that consist of these types of cells. And then again, we're going to talk about taxonomy, which is a classification system of organisms. And then we'll kind of lastly end on a point where we're trying to figure out how different organisms are related based off the morphologies that exist between their structures and regarding similarities, as well as genetic relationships. And all of that falls under the umbrella of taxonomy. So let's talk about cells as being the basis for life. Remember, the cell is the key unit of any living organism. It's the smallest unit of life and is going to express the basic characteristics that you need in order to have life. And those particular characteristics include genetic material as well as energy. So those are two primary features that a particular system, like a cell, needs to have in order to be considered life. And we have two specific categories of cells that fit underneath this scheme. Again, we have the eukaryotic cell and we have the prokaryotic cell. Many microorganisms are going to be considered prokaryotic organisms, which means they consist of cells that do not have what we believe to be a true nucleus, which is genetic material surrounded by a nuclear membrane. And the groups of organisms that fall in this category are going to be bacteria organisms and the archaea group. And the archaea group are organisms, if you recall from chapter 1, that reside in very extreme environments. Environments with extreme temperatures that can be incredibly high or incredibly cold. These specific types of organisms could also exist in areas where they are under a lot of pressure, such as the floor of the ocean. There's a number of organisms that fall into this particular group of organisms that's known as the archaea, and all of them are made up of what we refer to as prokaryotic cells. Now, not all microorganisms are going to be prokaryotes, and what that means is that we have some microorganisms that are going to also be considered to be eukaryotic in a sense, because they contain a true nucleus, which means that their genetic material is surrounded by a membrane-bound nucleus. Okay, and we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. Some other microbes that are considered to be prokaryotes that are not going to be made of any type of cells are going to be viruses, prions, and viroids. Actually, scratch that point. We have viruses, prions, and viroids that don't fall into either category of prokaryotic organisms or eukaryotic organisms. They fall into the category of being acellular, which means they do not have a nucleus. And I have a diagram to kind of highlight where these microorganisms fall into. So acellular microorganisms, again, they're not surrounded by any type of cell membrane. They are made of proteins and possibly some sort of protein outer coat to surround them or surround the genetic material. So with acellular microorganisms like viroids, prions, and viruses, you essentially have genetic material that is surrounded by a coat of protein, which we can refer to as a capsid. But that is not the same as a cell membrane, because remember, the structure of a cell membrane consists of a phospholipid bilayer which surrounds organelles inside of a cell. Organelles that would include things like mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum, and some other fun structures that we'll talk about in just a little bit. So our acellular microorganisms will again be the viroids, the prions, and the viruses. Our cellular microorganisms, these are going to be what are classified into the two groups of prokaryotic organisms and eukaryotic organisms. With the prokaryotic organisms, we have members of the archaea group, and another term that's used to classify these different groups is called a clade. So the archaea clade falls into this category of prokaryotic organisms. We have the bacteria clade, which our whole course is going to focus primarily on bacteria. And then we have a kind of a combination of both plant and bacteria that's known as cyanobacteria, which is essentially blue-green bacteria. And you can see these organisms growing in something like pond water. But these three different groups are primary examples of what prokaryotic organisms are. And remember, the key feature here with these organisms is the fact that they represent or are comprised of very simple cells, where their cells contain genetic material that is not surrounded by a nuclear membrane. Their cells will contain things like ribosomes, which are situated all throughout their cytoplasm. And in some instances, you'll have these small structures called plasmids, which are circular DNA, and that can primarily be found in the bacteria group. But for the most part, the prokaryotic organisms are very simple in structure. They have the simple nucleoid region without a membrane surrounding it, and then they have ribosomes situated throughout their cytoplasm. For the eukaryotic organisms, we have organisms, some that can be considered microscopic, such as algae, which is essentially a plant photosynthetic type of organism, plant-like organism. We have protists, which can be either plant-like or they can be animal-like in nature. But they are very small and they are typically unicellular. But the thing about them is they differ from bacteria because they contain a true nucleus where a nuclear membrane surrounds the genetic material. And then we also have members of the fungi group that exist as eukaryotic cells. The algae, the protozoans, and the fungi are all considered microorganisms. There's groups that belong in this particular category under the eukaryotes that are not listed, and that includes us. So humans' cells belong in the eukaryotic group because our cells contain a nucleus. Plants belong in the eukaryotic group because their cells contain a true nucleus, where there is a nuclear membrane that surrounds the genetic material inside the cell. But in the grand scheme of things, as we're talking about microorganisms, the key microorganisms that will be considered to be eukaryotic organisms are going to be algae, protozoans, and fungi. So we're going to look into some key differences to highlight the differentiation between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. And here's two really great images that kind of highlight those differences. So again, eukaryotic means true nucleus. Prokaryotic cells do not have a true nucleus. And to have a true nucleus, you need to have a nuclear membrane that will surround your genetic material. In our cells, we refer to that genetic material as chromosomes. And then inside of the nuclear membrane, as well as what the chromosomes situate themselves in, you have a gelatin-like structure that's known as the nucleoplasm. And the nucleoplasm is kind of the same as cytoplasm. It just resides inside of the nucleus and allows the genetic material to be situated inside of that nucleoplasm. Now, eukaryotic cells also have more complex structures than prokaryotic cells. As I said before, prokaryotic cells pretty much just have the nucleoid region, and then they have ribosomes situated throughout the cytoplasm. Eukaryotic cells are going to consist of more complex structures known as organelles, and an organelle is a structure that's inside of a eukaryotic cell that is membrane bound, so it consists of a membrane that surrounds it, and it has a definite function to be used by that cell. So if you look in this cell, you can see these specialized structures. So this is our eukaryotic cell, this is our prokaryotic cell. The eukaryotic cell has specialized structures that are membrane bound. One such I'm sure you've heard of before, which is called the mitochondria. This is the energy complex of the cell. This is where ATP is generated, and where we were talking about the processes of the electron transport chain and the Krebs cycle from the last chapter. All of those processes take place inside the mitochondria. Now, some other organelles we have in here include these lysosomes, which are used to digest waste that build up in the cell. And then we also have the endoplasmic reticulum, which is considered an organelle. We have ribosomes that are situated not throughout the cytoplasm, like we see in the prokaryotic cell, but situated where the endoplasmic reticulum is. And this is essentially the site of where the process of translation takes place, which is another process that we talked about. Remember when we talked about the central dogma theory? The final process that occurs in that theorem is the process of translation, and the translation occurs where these ribosomes are. So, and then there's some other structures in here, such as the Golgi complex, which is a packaging center for all the proteins that are developed through the ribosomes. We also have cytoplasm in here, but cytoplasm is not considered to be an organelle, but there are a lot of organelles that are in here. So lysosomes, the Golgi complex, the mitochondria, and the ribosomes all exist inside this cell. So what the eukaryotic cells and the prokaryotic cells do have in common is the fact that they are surrounded by a cell membrane, and that cell membrane has the capacity to allow certain items to flow in and outside of the cell. So the cell membrane that surrounds the cell is a phospholipid bilayer, and prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells are both contain this cell membrane. The cell membrane provides support, it provides protection, and it also again acts as kind of a selective permeable membrane that allows substances to pass in and out of it to ensure the functionality, growth, and development of the cell. Here's another diagram outlining the eukaryotic cell. Again, we have genetic material that's situated here. This whole structure is called the nucleus. Within the nucleus, you have the nucleolus, where you're going to have a high concentration of the chromosomes and DNA that exists inside of the nucleus. The nuclear membrane surrounds the nucleus. We have structures that come off of the nucleus known as the endoplasmic reticulum. We also have the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. One reticulum, the rough ER, is used for the process of translation, because the rough ER is where our ribosomes are situated, and that's where translation takes place to build proteins. And then we also have the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, which is the site of lipid synthesis, where you're not producing proteins, but you're producing lipids that will be used by the cell. We have some centrioles that are located in here, and these are help to assist the cell in the process of reproduction, such as mitosis. We also have lysosomes, again, which are used to digest the waste in the cell. We have vesicles that are used to allow waste to be transported out of the cell. You can see these waste products being released. Ribosomes, as I said, on the endoplasmic reticulum, which are these structures that surround the nuclear membrane. We have some peroxisomes, which are used to help digest things in the cell.